So one of the last major reasons for imperialism is religious in nature. So you had a bunch of missionary efforts that were taking place in the mid 19th century until the early 20th century. All right, so you're going to see significant religious revivalism taking place throughout Western Europe as well as the United States. It's going to be particularly strong in the middle class. And basically, because of this revivalism, the idea is since people were colonizing in these new countries anyway, well, why not spread Christianity to these new places, to Africa and Asia? Right, this is going to be more successful in sub-Saharan Africa than in Asia and Islamic North Africa. However, you do have some instances of uh, I hate to use the word successful because they're obviously forcing their religion on these societies, but there is obviously some Christian influence particularly in certain parts of Asia. Korea tends to be a very Christian country, or a much more Christian country compared to Japan and China. So you do see some missionary efforts actually being a little bit more fruitful, but also that's because there are continued missionary efforts now. Um, so uh, so the first person to do humanitarian and religious work in South and Central Africa was Dr. David Livingstone, and he ends up going down to South and Central Africa, and then he disappears for a while. This is in 1871. And H.M. Stanley, the same news reporter who went down to the Congo and signed all those sketchy treaties to get Leopold control of the Congo, he actually goes down and finds Livingstone. And the famous phrase that's associated with that is Dr. Livingstone, I presume, right? Because all these people figured that Livingstone was dead. All right, once he finds Livingstone, Stanley writes a bunch of newspaper reports about him finding Livingstone and about the work that he was doing down there. And it creates a bunch of European interest in Africa. All right, and this also is why Stanley seeks the aid of Leopold to then dominate the Congo region. So again, David Livingstone is sort of like the pioneer of missionary work in Africa, but of course many follow. And again, it goes along with this survival of the fittest social Darwinism doctrine, because again, by forcing religion or attempting to spread their religion to these societies that had a long standing that had other religious traditions, whether or not they were Muslim, whether or not they were more localized religions. This was yet another way that these European countries sought to control these African countries that they perceived as weaker. So, last but not least, we're going to talk about some of the critics or critiques of imperialism. All right, one of the most well-known that obviously we've already talked about was Karl Marx. Right, in 1867, he wrote the book Das Kapital, and his issue with imperialism was that he argued that it was all coming from the bourgeoisie, and that the bourgeoisie basically, like um, they kept needing to expand their markets to increase profits, and if they kept expanding their markets, if they always were looking for more and more people and more places to buy their goods, that inevitably was going to lead to the conquest of other peoples. All right, so again, he sees capitalism as the clear culprit of imperialism. Another well-known anti-imperialist was J.A. Hobson. All right, again, he's probably the most prominent. We think of Karl Marx as more of just a Marxist, not as an anti-imperialist, but anti-imperialism did go along with Marx's doctrine. But J.A. Hobson, again, made his mark as being an anti-imperialist. All right, and so what he said was that imperialist powers needed colonies in order to provide new markets for domestic European goods. So it goes along with Marx's idea in that sense. He also believed that businessmen and bankers were unduly influencing government's imperialist policies. All right, so again, he believed that imperialism only benefited the wealthy because of that. All right, so it's not these working class people that say, hey, why don't you control India because then we'll get more jobs by, working on the cotton that you import from there. It's people who already have money, who are ultimately driving imperialism. Also, Hobson believes that if European governments forced businesses to raise wages for workers, that this would result in an increased consumption of goods and less of a need for new markets abroad. So in other words, he thought that, you could kind of get around imperialism by just improving the economic situation at home. He thought that because governments were kind of diverting attention away from domestic policies through imperialism, we already talked about Germany and Russia as examples of that, that he's actually widening, or governments are actually widening the gap between the rich and the poor by doing this. All right, so he's saying that imperialism is the result of unregulated capitalism, and it doesn't have a good effect for all people equally. All right. In general, Hobson's arguments, actually, a lot of people, some people who analyze Hobson's arguments sometimes argue that his economic points were actually less convincing than the moral ones. All right, so there were a lot of people that actually believed that imperialism did benefit them economically by providing new markets for goods and creating new jobs, and there is some merit to this claim. So in a lot of ways, the kind of anti-social Darwinism, the more moral argument against imperialism sometimes held more water, because it was much easier to see how these people were being oppressed by having religion forced upon them, by ultimately having worse off living conditions. The arguments for imperialism tend to emphasize the benefits to European people rather than the drawbacks, rather than the negative effects on the people that were actually being colonized. Other things you see, basically, because of Hobson's influence, there is an increased emphasis on anti-imperialism throughout Europe. There are going to be a lot of socialists that support Hobson's link of capitalism with imperialism, so they see this as further fuel to defend socialism. And one of the most famous, prominent examples who supports this idea is Vladimir Lenin. He actually sees that imperialism is a huge contributor to colonial rivalries and war. So basically, like, he is predicting that war is eventually going to result from imperialism, and of course we know that to be true with World War I. An author who is anti-imperialism and depicts the dark side of imperialism is Joseph Conrad, who writes Heart of Darkness. All right, and so what he's doing is he's basically turning the idea of civilized and uncivilized upside down. Most, of course, social Darwinists argued that the people who were being colonized were the uncivilized, and the Europeans were the civilized. Well, he actually sees the Europeans as the true savages. All right, he argues that imperialists are selfish, and basically, he says that just because these people have superior weapons, doesn't necessarily mean that they are civilized. Their moral behavior shows that they are uncivilized and savage in nature. There's also just a general criticism that Europeans were, becoming more democratic politically at home, but at the same time, their governing of these new colonies was essentially dictatorial. So, there are a lot of people that are anti-imperialist just because they say, well, why don't you treat these people in Africa and Asia the same way you were treating people at home? Okay, so the last section, we're going to, again, turn back to Asia and also look at India and look at the ramifications of imperialism there, and then we will be finished with this chapter. Now, this last section is actually going to be significant because, well, it's going to be important for you to definitely check out this video and look over the notes extensively, because I will be in Montreal, and so this video is going to basically supplement what we would do as a class. So you might want to watch it multiple times. I'll give you some additional ways to access information about it too, but all of us are going to be responsible for taking a test on this material. We just simply do not have time to take a day off when Model UN is up in Canada. So, all right, I will catch up on the next video regarding Canada. Sorry, I'm going to be in Canada. The next video is going to be on China, Japan, and India. All right, thanks.